Welcome to Mass Office on Disabilities quarterly Level Up to Equality webinar. This is our second Level Up presentation, and we're very happy that you're joining us today. My name is Naomi Goldberg, and I am the Assistant Director for Disability Rights at Mass Office on Disability. And the topic of today's presentation is Understanding Effective Communication. So on this slide, we have an image of the words questions and answers with 3 different question marks and text bubbles that are pink, green, blue, red, and orange. Just to mention a few of our housekeeping items. During the presentation, you aren't going to be able to interact with us using the chat feature. We are going to be using the chat feature to post information to you, but you will not be able to respond. So first, if you have any questions about interacting with this platform or you're having technical difficulties, please refer to the chat feature for direction. We did send a document that has some troubleshooting ideas, but in the chat feature, we've posted information including who to contact for technical difficulties. So that should be in the chat now. For this webinar, we have 2 American Sign Language interpreters today. We also have a CART reporter. So to access captions, you can hit the captioning button and also refer to the chat feature where we've posted a link that will connect you to the transcript. So we are not going to be taking any questions during this presentation. If we have time at the end, we'll take a few. And if you do have questions about the content of the presentation, you can post them using the Q&A feature. And when doing so, please, please, please include your email address with the question, either before or after. This will allow us to contact you with an answer if we aren't able to get to your question during the presentation. On the screen here, we have a picture of Mary Mahan McCauley, who is the Executive Director of MOD. She is smiling. She has blonde hair. She's wearing sunglasses, and she's standing in front of her desk at MOD. Mary, at the end of this, we're switching the order up a little bit. At the end of the presentation, she's going to provide some updates on some initiatives that MOD is working on. Okay. So before we get started, I'm just going to provide a very brief introduction to MOD's work for those of you who may be unfamiliar with us. And if I were to describe MOD and I only had one sentence to do so, I would use the explanation that's on the screen. MOD serves as a resource to state agencies, municipalities, and members of the general public by providing information, guidance, and training on matters concerning disability-related civil rights, equal access, and opportunity. So just to get into a very little bit more detail about some of our most significant duties and functions. They're not in order of importance, just in alphabetical order. So we are the ADA and Section 504 coordinator for the executive branch of state government. And in this role, we provide guidance and training to other state agencies to ensure that they're complying with ADA and other disability-related laws. We, of course, offer this training and guidance, but these agencies also come to us to get assistance in trying to resolve disability-related issues with members of the public and employees. And certainly when we notice that agencies, there's some systemic issues with barriers for people with disabilities to participate, we notify them of what we found. Next, we have our Municipal ADA Improvement Grant, which is a really great program. It's we receive a certain amount of money to share with municipalities for projects that will, to make improvements to accessibility within municipalities. And it's really timely today. And Mary will talk a little bit more about the grant when she speaks later. But I'd like to point out that there have been several municipalities who've used this grant to enhance their ability to meet effective communication obligations. We funded a grant the grant has funded a Braille printer for a municipality, an assistive listening, entire system, and some personal amplifiers. And of course, anyone here who's from municipal government may want to look into the grant for effective communication reasons or certainly other reasons. We at MOD have the Client Assistance Program, which is a federal grant that we have to provide information and advocacy to applicants to and consumers of vocational rehab services at the Mass Commission for the Blind and the Mass Rehab Commission, and also for consumers of the 10 independent living centers. If individuals have concerns about vocational rehab or independent living services, they can contact CAP. Also, one of the things CAP does is we provide information about Title I of the ADA, which is the part of the ADA that deals with employment rights. And CAP in recent months has started a employment disclosure and employment series that we have monthly workshops. And right now we're just previewing our workshop on reasonable accommodation, and we will post a link to this in the end. Maybe someone could do that in the chat. I'm not sure if it's there, if people are interested in the workshops. So additionally, MOD sits on the Massachusetts Architectural Access Board, which develops and enforces regulations designed to make public buildings accessible, functional, and safe for people with disabilities. Our personal emergency preparedness program educates people with disabilities on how to individually prepare for an emergency, also providing information on resources and essential emergency supplies. There are meetings convened around the state where local emergency planners are typically in attendance. As I mentioned before, MOD provides technical guidance around disability-related civil rights matters and information, and as well as architectural access issues. We are the state affiliate to the New England ADA Center, which is one of the 10 ADA information centers throughout the country. And we're the Massachusetts affiliate, and we collaborate on projects and events. And finally, we are the technical advisor to local commissions on disabilities. We speak with the commissions often and convene meetings so people can hear about current issues and discuss them. Okay, so now we will get into the presentation. So on this screen, we have a visual of cartoon figures who appear to be employees wearing business attire and standing in a group. On either side, there are two people using megaphones in their direction. The employees have empty text bubbles above their heads, and the caption reads, "Are you communicating effectively?" So what we hope that you will get out of this presentation is that you'll understand basic effective communication obligations under the Americans with Disabilities Act. We hope that you will recognize scenarios in which people with disabilities will need auxiliary aids and other support, and that you'll be familiar with auxiliary aids, what they are. We hope it will allow people to prepare, to avoid and remove barriers to effective communication. We are going to be offering some best practices for meeting effective communication obligations. And finally, we'll briefly discuss how MOD can be a resource in these matters. So to start, we'll speak briefly about some general ADA obligations, sort of as an entree to the discussion about the more specific effective communication obligations. So throughout the presentation, I'm going to be referring to Title II and Title III entities. So I'll just define them. A Title II entity is a state agency or local government entity. A Title III entity is a place of public accommodation, which is a place that's open to the public, such as businesses, nonprofit organizations, retail establishments, restaurants, etc. So the ADA requires that state and local governments meet these 5 administrative requirements that are listed in these bullets here. First, they must identify an ADA coordinator, and that's the person who's responsible for compliance with the ADA, and that's the point of contact for disability-related issues. Title II entities have to have a clearly outlined grievance procedure for when people are finding that there's a disability-related barrier or issue and they can't equally participate. The grievance procedure and the contact information for the ADA coordinator is required to be posted publicly. And then there is a requirement to self-evaluate. A self-evaluation is an assessment of all programs, services, activities, and buildings. And the assessment identifies barriers to equal participation. And those barriers, if possible, need to be fixed. What then happens is there's this transition plan, which identifies the barriers that couldn't be immediately fixed and indicates how these things are going to be addressed moving forward as more resources become available. And the transition plan is a living document that helps the entity, figure out their accessibility plans, and it's fluid and it's changing over time as you make changes, as new things develop. So this is something that, again, state and local governments are required to do. Places of public accommodation, Title III entities, are not required to have an ADA coordinator or post a grievance procedure or do any of these things that we've mentioned, but it may be a best practice when you're interacting with the public to have someone who will deal with an issue when someone thinks they're being denied a service based on disability, and identifying that person and identifying how you're going to deal with those situations and maybe post that information. Okay, so on this screen, we have a grid of 16 different blue and white disability symbols, including the universal access symbol, the TTY, a parking sign, a service animal, a figure walking with a cane, among other images. And so what is effective communication? It is the exchange of information in a way that is clear to all parties involved in the interaction. Communication can be oral, written, or otherwise. Okay, so we know that some people with communication disabilities might need auxiliary aids and services in order to ensure that they can communicate as effectively as possible. And here we have some examples of auxiliary aids. And this is not an exhaustive list, but I will read them: large print and braille materials, electronic materials in an accessible format. We have CART. The acronym is for Communication Access Real-Time Translation. You can see we have CART today. ASL, American Sign Language Interpreter Services. You can see we have ASL interpreters here with us today. Assistive listening devices, providing oral instructions, and possibly pen and paper for a quick exchange. So the ADA in general requires Title II and Title III entities to ensure that people with disabilities can equally participate in activities, services, and
Naomi, this is Jeff. It appears you have gone silent. So if everyone can just hold on for a moment as we address the technical difficulties, we should be back very shortly. And I'm sorry, we are just still waiting. It looks like Naomi's got her computer back up or something back up. Just looking for
Okay.
the, oh, thank you.
I apologize. I am in the office, so it wasn't my home computer. I came to make sure that I didn't lose my computer turned off. I apologize. Okay, so the ADA in general requires Title II and Title III entities to ensure that people with disabilities can equally participate in activities, services, and programs, just as their non-disabled peers do. And we all know that in order to participate in or access any kind of service or program, it involves communication. So providing effective communication will ensure that people with communication disabilities can equally participate in programs, services, and activities. So communicating effectively means that a person with a communication disability can communicate with someone, they can receive information from the other person in an understandable way, and that the person can fully convey information to others. Okay, so next we are going to discuss effective communication obligations and offer some best practices for meeting those obligations. So the first piece would be to reflect inward on what your program is and what it offers, and then to make a plan to figure out how you can ensure that communication is effective when operating your program or service. Then we talk about how to implement a plan, and a big part of implementing a plan is navigating the interactive process. And then, of course, you have to continually reflect and update that plan as needed. So we're going to get into that in some more detail. So a good way for a government agency or a place of public accommodation to begin tackling the issue of effective communication is to really take stock of how they operate with respect to communication. What we've called it here is reflecting inward. So by doing that, you're identifying the services and programs that you offer. You're considering the ways you need to communicate with consumers or customers in the day-to-day and how they would communicate with you in the context of your program, your service, your business. So this really sounds like the self-evaluation that I mentioned before that Title II entities have done. They've actually had to do it since the 70s with Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act, and then again in the 90s with the passage of the ADA. So Title II entities should already have their self-evaluations and in general, looking at, evaluating their programs and services. But what we're talking about here is evaluating a program with a focus on communication. So now we're going to talk about some of the basic areas of communication to think about. So, and again, this is not a requirement. These are just some suggestions. So when you're doing this, you'd start by identifying all the services you provide. Do you have printed or written materials, brochures, fact sheets, invoices, electronic documents? What is your web-based content? Do you have a website, and what things are on your website? What kind of standard business interactions and transactions do you make? Are they on the phone? Are they in person? Are there conversations that people have? What events do you put out? Are there presentations, trainings, public meetings, activities? And what internal and external types of meetings do you have? So now that you've thought about these areas, you would consider, how are people with communication disabilities going to access those services? So people who are visually impaired might need a large print copy to read materials, or maybe someone needs materials read aloud. Of course, if you use assistive technologies, like perhaps a screen reader, you would need a website to be compatible with the software that you have. A person with a communication disability might need extra time and assistance to communicate during in-person interactions. People who are unable to comprehend written materials might need someone to further explain the content of a document. Maybe a person who's hard of hearing will need an assistive listening device or sound amplification for a meeting. So how would you meet your effective communication obligations under these circumstances now that you've thought about it? And what would you do going forward? So you may want to consider developing a plan that addresses effective communication. If you've thought about all of this in advance and you have a plan in place, you're certainly able to more easily meet your effective communication obligations with the people you serve. You could potentially reduce delays in service, and you will be flexible enough to respond to on-the-spot requests because you have to respond to on-the-spot requests, but we're going to get to that in a few minutes. So these communication obligations exist. You don't need to implement a separate plan in order to meet the obligations, but it may be considered a best practice to do so. So I think the first step in making a plan is probably to identify the point person. And as I've said earlier, a Title II entity already has done this because they've had to designate an ADA coordinator who's responsible for compliance. They may or may not assign effective communication type things to someone else, but they are the point person. And of course, Title III entities don't have to have a designated ADA coordinator, but they could easily identify someone who's in charge of making these kinds of arrangements for people and scheduling auxiliary aids and finding them. So regardless of whether an entity opts to create a separate plan for communication, it really would never be possible to fully meet obligations if the staff doesn't have knowledge that there is an obligation, because you will need staff to participate in providing effective communication. So it's really important to notify staff, particularly frontline staff, of the obligation to provide effective communication, and to make them aware of any policies that are relevant to communication, what their role is in providing effective communication, and of course, who the point person is. Okay, so let's talk about some of the particulars. How would we plan for providing effective communication with printed and written materials? First, you can make commonly distributed materials accessible and readily available, including the content you have created and others' content that you may distribute. So for printed materials, that may mean making materials into large print or braille. And oftentimes printed materials are available electronically, and you want to make sure that those are accessible as well. I want to let you know, although it's not, it's nearly completed, we are putting out a guidance document that gives a basic overview of how to create an accessible document in Microsoft Word. It explains the basics of accessibility principles, so the concepts can really be applied when creating documents and other applications. In the coming weeks, this will be posted on our website, and perhaps we can send it to participants when it's ready. So next, you'd want to identify vendors who may be able to assist with making documents accessible if needed. And I'd like to point out for municipalities who are listening, there is a statewide IT accessibility services contract. It's ITS 61. And this helps state and local government entities get expert assistance to ensure that information technology services don't discriminate against people with disabilities. And among the categories of services provided is document remediation. I should probably mention the other services that are available under this contract: accessibility auditing, accessibility consulting, accessibility training. This is all in technology stuff. Multimedia transcription, captioning and description, assistive technology scripting. So there's a link to the website that has more on this if you want to look into it, people who are from municipalities. So again, for the printed and written materials, there should be you would commit going forward to creating documents in an accessible format. Hopefully the document we're creating will be helpful for you in that if people want to use it as a resource. And in cases where it's really impossible to make materials accessible in a timely manner, you should identify alternative ways where you can meet obligations. So just to give an example, if you were in a municipality and you billed for water, you use a third party to invoice people. And let's say a person who has a print disability, doesn't read print for whatever reason, said, I can't access my bill. And the municipality needed to figure out how they could make invoices accessible and speak to the third party. How could they address it in a timely manner so that the person could read the contents of their bill? And the obligation would be to think about whether there's an alternative in the meantime to meet the effective communication obligations. And maybe that means, can I read you the important pieces? Can I write them down in an accessible way and send them to you electronically? So just to give an example that there's always an obligation if you can't do something quickly. Okay, so now we're going to talk about website accessibility and planning for effective communication. So it's the Department of Justice, DOJ, that enforces the ADA. And as I mentioned, the ADA has general non-discrimination provisions for ensuring that people with disabilities can equally participate, and also obviously specifically obligates effective communication. The Department of Justice has not yet promulgated specific web accessibility standards through regulations that Title II and Title III entities have to follow. But with regard to web accessibility, DOJ has consistently taken the position that the absence of a specific regulation doesn't serve as a basis for noncompliance with a statute's requirements. So this really means that DOJ's position is that websites are not exempt from effective communication obligations, even if they're not, don't have in a regulation what guidelines to follow. So if an entity has a website, the information communicated should be accessible to and usable by people with disabilities with various assistive technologies. So I do want to point out that in many of DOJ's settlement agreements with Title II and Title III entities concerning the lack of accessibility with websites, DOJ has pointed to the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, WCAG is the acronym. Okay, so it's WCAG 2.0 level AA as a set of guidelines that websites should be measured against. And WCAG is a set of guidelines developed by the World Wide Web Consortium, which is an international body of experts who help develop standards for the web. So much like building code, web standards are meant to set a basic threshold of accessibility, which hopefully ensures that a website can be used by a majority of the population. So you have to keep in mind that even if you have a website that complies with WCAG 2.0 level AA, there may be some users that still may have difficulty accessing the information. And in that case, the entity would still have obligations in accommodating that person to ensure effective communication. So that was a lot. So as you can see here on this slide, we're recommending that websites be measured against WCAG 2.1 level AA. And this set of standards has been around since 2018, and it replaced the previous one that I mentioned, which came about in 2008. And our guess is that DOJ will likely point to this new standard for future settlement agreements. This 2.1 standard encompasses all of the guidelines presented in the previous rendition, but they provide additional guidelines for mobile responsive websites, support for low vision users, and additional support for people with learning disabilities. So with all that said, you should consider measuring your website against the most recent WCAG 2.1 level AA as a starting point. Okay. So another way to make, another thing to do would be to have an assistive technology user provide some feedback on your website to ensure it's compatible with different assistive technologies, maybe a screen reader, maybe a person who uses a keyboard only. And of course, you should make sure that all new content uploaded on the website is compatible with assistive technology. That piece is, about looking forward. Okay. So how about planning for effective communication for business interactions and transactions? It certainly would make sense to establish some policies and practices that ensure effective communication in these types of scenarios, and with some focus on how staff have to be involved. So, for example, maybe in a shorter interaction, a person might need to write with a pen and paper, and that would involve a frontline staff person knowing that they need to do that to help someone, assist someone in filling out a document, to explain something that is written in print. So again, it's really important that employees, staff know about their obligations to assist a person who has a communication disability in accessing services. And, in some cases, it may be necessary to, people need to know who the contact person is. But again, other people will have to participate, and they can't just say, I'm going to have to refer you to this other person who works on Fridays. Okay, so now we are talking about planning effective communication for public meetings, events, and activities. Um, it you can post notice in advance. So when you're having a meeting, to post a notice in advance, when you publicize it, about how to request effective communication or accommodations, including a deadline for participants to submit their requests, and who the point of contact is. For those of us who in state agencies or municipalities, we have to follow the open meeting law. So that at a minimum requires 48 hours notice to post a public meeting. And, I think we know that for certain auxiliary aids like interpreters and CART services, you need to schedule them in advance to ensure that you get one, and it takes a long time. So even though the minimum time for the open meeting law is 48 hours, it may make sense for people to post notice well in advance of that. So that you can ensure that you have everything in place. And of course, ASL and CART need to be scheduled way in advance, and longer meetings may require 2 ASL interpreters. So, and then when you post that someone can request effective communication, at that point you can reserve ASL and CART, and then if no one responds to you by a particular date, you could cancel without penalty, with enough advance notice. I think in some cases, entities should consider whether it makes sense, and it would make sense to secure ASL and CART and have them regardless of whether someone requests it. When we have a state of emergency, there's always an interpreter standing next to the governor. It's not a question of, because we know that people in the public will need that for important meetings, particularly when you know that there are people who would be using it. You might consider not even bothering to find out whether someone needs it. For example, for this presentation, we know that we're serving the disability community, and whether or not someone asks us, we think there's an expectation that we have that available. So if you're having a virtual meeting, you should, of course, make sure the platform has the capacity to accommodate CART and interpreters. And I think on the resource slide later on, we have a link to a document that we created for state agencies around making meetings accessible. So people should consider what their audio systems are entities should, for holding meetings, to make sure that audio systems, have the capacity to, link to hearing aids or assistive listening devices. And people or entities rather should commit to holding meetings in rooms that have audio systems. And one step further is to make a policy that anyone speaking must use a microphone, not just speakers, but also members of the audience. So telling people to wait to use the microphone to speak ensures that everyone can be heard. Now, if you have assistive listening devices, make sure that they are maintained, they're charged, there are batteries, they're readily available. I know I keep referring to municipalities in this. I know that they often have meetings that are in the evenings. You want to make sure that the assistive listening devices aren't locked in someone's office who works from 9 to 5. For meetings, making sure that all materials are available in alternative formats. And finally, to inform speakers and presenters that are referencing visual materials during presentations, we'll describe them to the audience. Okay, so what now? Assuming you've prepared the best to the best of your ability to meet effective communication obligations, what do you do next? You've taken inventory of your programs and services, and you've thought about how people communicate in the context of your business or your program. You've created policies around effective communication, you've trained staff, you've procured auxiliary aids and services, you've put your materials into alternative format, you've got your website evaluated. What do? You provide the auxiliary aid and service when people request it. It's pretty straightforward. But certainly there may be some instances that are less straightforward. And in those situations, you really need to analyze the particulars of the situation in context. You're going to have to analyze the particulars and then engage in the interactive process. So the interactive process is really prompted by the person who's expressing that they have a disability related need for an auxiliary aid or service. And the entity that receives the request has the obligation to engage in a discussion about how to meet the individual's disability related need under the circumstances. And of course, that is if, it's not something that it's something that you should just do, but if you can't, you're doing this interactive dialogue. In the next coming slides, we're going to talk about how to evaluate requests, how to respond, how to gain an understanding of what undue burden means, what fundamental alteration means, and then we're discussing what is appropriate for an auxiliary aid or service and who gets to decide what is appropriate. What happens when someone makes a request for an auxiliary aid or service? The request is made by the person with a disability. They're explaining what they need and what works best for them. And very important here, there is no need to provide supporting documentation. Again, you should provide the aid and meet the request, but if there's some question on the end of the entity, they're going to have to evaluate it. And when you're evaluating it, part of the evaluation is considering the nature of the communication, the length, the complexity, and the context. You're considering what the individual's normal method of communication is. How do they work best? If the request, ultimately the request has to allow the individual to receive the information in a way that's understandable and that they can convey information back to the covered entity. So just to give an example, I'll give an employment example. I'm a person who is deaf and my first language is American Sign Language and not English. My employer can't hire an ASL interpreter to work with me 40 hours a week, but I got some, they used an interpreter for my training so that I was very clear on what my job responsibilities are. But in the day-to-day, I'm able to, my employer can communicate with me to give basic instructions for what my daily tasks are with an email. But if I'm going to have a performance review or, again, the training that I mentioned, it would be necessary for me, because the context and the nature and the time of this communication is very important. I need to understand what's being said to me, and I need to be able to speak back to my employer so that they can understand me in my first language. So just as a note, it's very important to make determinations on a case-by-case basis. So it's a new evaluation every time. If you're saying, if you're considering that you can't just immediately provide what's asked for, and just because you may have denied a request at one time doesn't mean it's the same the next time. It's a new evaluation. So again, if an entity is in receipt of a request and can easily meet it, they should. If they're analyzing the request more closely, they have to keep in mind the obligation to participate in the interactive process, and they must do so willingly. So the goal should be to engage in the interactive process, to meet the needs that the person has requested to the best of your ability. It's to be responsive within a reasonable amount of time. It's to have a person who's accountable for this request. That's a point person who handles the request and keeps you updated on its status. And if an entity can't meet the request, they must respond with an explanation and offer an alternative that will meet the needs of the individual so that they can communicate effectively. So now we're going to talk about a few instances in which an entity may not have to provide a particular auxiliary aid. And so those instances are if it would result in an undue administrative or financial burden. So that's the first instance in which they may not have to do it. So what is an undue burden? It's a significant difficulty or expense. So if providing a particular auxiliary aid or service would result in an undue burden, the entity is responsible for providing and finding another effective aid or service that wouldn't result in an undue burden. And determining what constitutes an undue burden is going to vary from entity to entity and sometimes from year to year. There's changing economic conditions, there are changing resources, and they also should be considering the cost in relation to the overall financial resources of the entity. So again, this is a case-by-case analysis. It's not just we do it or, we didn't do it last time, we're not doing it this time. We're looking at all the particulars of the situation to determine whether it's truly an undue burden, not just I don't feel like doing this. So now we're going to talk about what a Title II entity responsibility is with respect to undue burden. State and local governments, Title II entities are obligated to consider the cost of the aid or service in relation to all resources available, and the effect on other expenses or operations. This is not a decision that's made lightly. It should be made by a high-level official, no lower than a department head. And there must be a written statement of the reasons for reaching the conclusion of undue burden if that is what the entity is saying. Okay, so when we're talking about Title III entities, they must take into consideration the nature and cost of the aid or service relative to their size, their financial resources, and overall expenses. So a place of public accommodation that has greater resources is expected to do more to meet effective communication. More of a responsibility than one with fewer resources. So if the entity has a parent company, you would be looking at the administrative and financial relationship with that parent company, as well as the size, the resources, and the expenses of the parent company. Okay, so just to give an example of undue burden, a person who is deaf arrives at a town zoning meeting and says that they need an ASL interpreter. The town had publicly posted instructions to contact the ADA coordinator with effective communication needs by a specific date, and that date is obviously passed, and the person didn't follow the procedure. So certainly the town can say it's not possible for us to obtain an ASL interpreter with such short notice, but they don't get to say, well, you didn't do what you were supposed to do, so we're not going to help. The town still has an obligation to ask if there's an alternative auxiliary aid or service that would work to meet the person's communication needs, and they should provide it, you know, if they can. Okay, so another reason that a Title II or Title III entity would not have to provide an auxiliary aid or service would be in the rare circumstance where it would fundamentally alter the nature of the goods or services that they provide. So, so just to give an example of a fundamental alteration, there's a performance and slowing down the action on stage in order to describe the action for patrons with visual impairments may fundamentally alter the nature of the performance. Now, in that case, the entity still has obligations to explore alternative ways to describe the performance. And again, that's the interactive dialogue that we've talked about previously. So in another example, a person who's deaf requests for the lights in a planetarium to be raised so that they can see the interpreter. So since it's necessary for it to be dark in order to experience a planetarium exhibit, this would fundamentally alter the experience for everyone if you turned on the lights. So even though the planetarium could deny that request, they would still have obligations to explore other possibilities. In this instance, a possible solution may be to offer the patron a seat off to the side and to, you know, have the interpreter close to them with a dim light in front of them. Okay, so now we come to the question of who decides what is the most appropriate aid. So the responsibilities or the obligations under ADA for Title II and Title III entities are different when it comes to choosing an aid or service in response to a person's request. So both can require reasonable advance notice from people requesting aids or services based on how long it takes to get the aid or service, but they cannot impose excessive advance notice requirements. It's still an obligation for both to respond on the spot and, you know, see what's possible. And again, that's part of the interactive process. Okay, so in terms of who decides what the most appropriate aid for Title II entities, state and local governments, they must give primary consideration to the choice of aid or service that is requested by the person who has the communication disability. It's not just like, we think this is expensive and we don't want to do it. That's, they must give primary consideration, and they should honor the person's choice unless they can demonstrate that another equally effective means of communication is available, or that by providing it, it's going to result in a fundamental alteration or undue burden. So if the choice that the person wants would result in an undue burden or a fundamental alteration, again, the entity still has an obligation to provide an alternative aid or service that provides effective communication. Okay, so for Title III entities, places of public accommodations, they are encouraged to consult with the person with a disability to talk about what aid or service is appropriate for them, and to prioritize an aid or service that will be effective given the person's method of communicating and the nature of what's being communicated. Okay, so on this slide, we have a sign, a green sign with, you know, white, with white, there's a an arrow pointing up, and then there is the word reevaluate. So should always be continually reflecting on this effective communication obligation. A good plan, if someone chooses to make one, is going to be adaptable and fluid. You have to take into consideration what happens going forward. There are always going to be technology advancements. You're always going to be creating and publishing new material, using other people's material, changing your website. You are always going to have new requests from the public, and laws and guidance are always changing. So you're always going to have to reevaluate. So it doesn't stop with making a plan one time. So now we're going to briefly discuss recourse and offer a few resources. If an individual with a disability believes that their effective communication needs haven't been met, if it's from a town, a city or town, or a state or a state government agency, rather, sorry, they should follow the state and local government's internal grievance procedure. I mentioned before that was one of the administrative requirements. There must be a grievance procedure. If that grievance procedure doesn't resolve the issue, the person has the right to file a complaint at the Department of Justice or the Mass Commission Against Discrimination. And for a place of public accommodation, if a person doesn't believe their effective communication needs have been met, they can also file a complaint at the Department of Justice or the Commission Against Discrimination. So on this slide, we have a few resources, information on effective communication. We also have the memo, MOD's memo that we had previously sent to state agencies on making inclusive virtual meetings or holding inclusive virtual meetings. Okay, so I'd like to encourage everyone here to use MOD as a resource. Again, we provide information and technical guidance on disability-related civil rights and access issues, including effective communication. So if you're looking to understand your obligations, or you're a person who's looking to understand your rights, or anyone wants to know about best practices for effective communication, understanding rights and obligations in context, please reach out to us. Keep in mind, we're not an enforcement agency. We'll provide you information. If an impasse is reached, we refer people to file complaints at enforcement agencies. And here is our contact information. And I think we are going to hear from Mary. Maybe we are.
Yep. Naomi Mary's here. I'm
Okay.
just going to pass the microphone to her.
Okay.
Great job. Give me 1 second.
Hello, everyone. This is Mary Mahan McCauley, and I'm the Executive Director of the Massachusetts Office on Disability. And first of all, thank you, Naomi Goldberg. You did a fabulous job. And I realize that you and your team, many of the team within Mass Office on Disability employees helped a lot with this presentation, and it was really great. I just wanted to speak for a little bit, just to share some information and updates on what our agency is doing. And not a complete list of what's happening, which would take much too long, because for a small agency, we're involved in many, many things. We only have about 14 employees, but are involved in a lot of various initiatives and boards and commissions and so forth. But just to list 4 at this point, I'd like to let everyone know, especially those that are listening, that wear a hat within a municipality, within city town government in Massachusetts, that we have a grant program that we've been running for about 5 years now. And it's the Municipal ADA, Americans with Disabilities Act, a Municipal ADA Capital Improvement improvement grant. And within that improvement grant, cities and towns around the Commonwealth of Mass specifically can apply for either planning grants or project grants when they're working on any kind of project or planning, which is a self-evaluation or transition plan, to work on ADA-specific projects within their cities or towns. The full amount is $2 million that we're able to allocate from this amount, which is broken down into several grants. We have a couple at the $250,000 mark, or sometimes there could just be one, and many last year were around $50,000. But for the FY22 fiscal year, which is, as all of you know, if you're from municipalities, the state fiscal year runs from July 1st, 2021 through June 30th, 2022. For this current fiscal year that we're in, the application process to be able to apply for one of these grants begins on August 2nd, next month, August 2nd, and ends on October 1st. So please go to the website to look up more information, to get more details, and would love to see more applications. We have a committee that looks closely at all of them when they choose which individual cities and towns will be able to receive the monies. It is a competitive process, but please apply, and everyone is looked at very closely, every one of the applications. Secondly, I wanted to let folks know that one of the initiatives we're doing within state government, which this is not something that is with the outside of the government right now, but I think it's one of our very important initiatives, is that we have an assistive technology / information technology working group. And basically that group is made up of many individuals across state government and the different secretariats and agencies. And we're really working on clearer and better process to assure that the best assistive technology, that information technology is adapted and can be used with assistive technology to the best of the ability. So there's a lot of moving pieces with that. It's very complicated when you look at procurements, whether that's for software on a small basis or a larger one. The administration is committed to accessibility, and that this group is part of, it's really showing that's true. And we're going to be doing a lot of work on that moving forward. We've been meeting during this year, 2021, the calendar year. Thirdly, we have a client assistance program, which is within Mass Office on Disability, and that group works with vocational rehabilitation and independent living centers, and just really gets the word out about what is voc rehab, what is IL, assists individuals find those kinds of services, individuals with disabilities, and also works with people that may have some communication issues or be just really looking more into their rights in VR and what their services can be, and just talk to someone outside of VR and IL. And they are presenting a regular series right now. Right now, there's a series on reasonable accommodation in employment. So that's also a great take. It would be really helpful for any person to sign up for that, any person with a disability. And most of us, as being a person with a disability, the idea of reasonable accommodation, the idea of disclosure comes up when you're thinking of job seeking. And there's experts there that will help you work around disclosure issues as well as reasonable accommodation. And lastly, do I have another minute here?
Yes.
Yeah. Lastly, and just to wrap up, the diversity and equity and inclusion group, I just want to give them a quick mention within our agency. We began last year with the diversity, equity, and inclusion group, and they are working within the agency to look at various programs of what we're doing, to add additional training so that we stay on the top of things, that we especially look at and continue to work with people from all various minority groups, people in the BIPOC community with disabilities, and make sure that we're reaching out to all populations. And that's it for now, just kind of a bit of a public service announcement. Thank you for joining us, and we will be having these quarterly webinars on various topics. Thank you very much. And thanks again, Naomi. Great job.
Okay, thanks, Mary. We just had 3 questions and they're pretty quick ones, so I can just go through with them. We had one question where someone had said that when in the past, when they had been providing things in large print, they were also told that there needed to be large print documents needed to be on blue paper, and wanted to know if that was a requirement. That isn't a universal requirement. There are requirements for contrast, but that sounds like something that, a particular individual found to be useful to them. And I think that takes us back to speaking about the interactive process and, really taking into account what the person says and what they've asked for. So the answer is blue paper isn't a universal thing. It must have just been something that one person wanted. Okay, we had another question about whether interpreter services included ASL and certified deaf interpreters. And I apologize for not including that, but yes, interpreter services could mean both. And finally, we had a question about whether landlords could use MOD as a resource. This person gets a lot of questions related to landlords not understanding obligations. And the answer to that is yes. Anyone can contact us to ask a question about, disability related rights, laws, and we're happy to have a conversation about it and offer some guidance. So please feel free to reach out to us. We do answer questions from the public and we have a phone number and that we answer, a general line. It's not answered live, but we do respond to every call that we receive. So I want to thank you for putting up with a very long presentation, and I hope that people find it useful, and thanks. And if you have any questions, please get back to us. And I think we're going to be forwarding you some documents in the future that, as they're completed. So, and keep updated on our website because we always have new information there. Thanks.
And Naomi, that's concluding the presentation, correct?
Yes, I apologize. Yes, we are concluding the presentation.
Okay. So thank you everybody for attending. Have a great day. And we'll have the next one in October, right?
Yes, I apologize. Yes, in October, stay tuned. It will be employment related.
Thank you.